Her name was Amina Hassan, and until that morning, she had believed that small kindnesses were given in school. She was 16, the oldest child of immigrant parents who had moved to the city when she was 10, and she had spent the last 6 years adjusting to a world where she was constantly reminded of her difference. She was dark-skinned in a sea of pale faces, and she often felt her classmates' eyes flick toward her as though she were a living question mark. Where does she fit? Who does she think she is? Why is her hair so different? But she'd always believed that in a place called Northbrook High, where the walls were lined with motivational posters and the principal's voice echoed promises of inclusivity during every assembly, she would at least be treated with basic decency. That morning, the sky was pale and overcast, as though the sun were too ashamed to rise. Amina walked through the front gates clutching a stack of textbooks, her backpack sagging with the weight of calculus and world history. She felt a small bird of unease flutter in her chest, as though she sensed something was about to shift. Over the past year, she'd been earning top grades, tutoring younger students, and volunteering at the local community center. She had become known to teachers as studious, polite, and quietly ambitious. They assumed she would follow the predictable path of valedictorian turned college student. They did not anticipate that one small everyday event, a simple request for a pen, would unravel the fragile cocoon of safety she had built. She arrived late to first period, apologizing to her English teacher, Mr. Reynolds, who sat at a mahogany desk cluttered with marked papers. He looked up from the essay he was grading and gave her a curt nod. She slid into the seat next to her friend Lila, who offered a sympathetic smile. Amina fixed her eyes on the open notebook before her. As the lesson began, Shakespeare's Hamlet, she wondered, as she always did, how people of her skin color spoke in Elizabethan England. She had researched it before, discovering that history always seemed to whitewash the contributions and experiences of people who looked like her. She wrote neatly in blue ink, careful to form each letter clearly so that Mr. Reynolds would not ask her to rewrite it. She had learned that he had an aversion to illegible handwriting. He considered it disrespectful to the text itself. At the end of the hour, she gathered her papers and stuffed them into her binder. She rose to leave and felt her phone buzz with a text from Lila, reminding her that Mrs. Patel's math class awaited. She jogged down the hallway, passing lockers smeared with stickers that boasted cartoon characters and sports team logos. The corridor smelled faintly of floor wax and too many bodies packed into a confined space. She approached Mrs. Patel's room, labeled 3B. The door was ajar, and from inside, she heard the rattle of chalk on the blackboard. She opened the door quietly and stepped into a world of triangles and algebraic equations scrawled 2 feet high. Students sat in rows of wooden desks, their attention fixed on the rising voice of their teacher. Mrs. Patel, whose full name was Asha Patel, was respected for her rigorous approach to mathematics. Her crisp sari and meticulous bun of hair gave her a fierceness that sometimes intimidated students. Amina took a seat in the second row, near the window where slats of light fell onto her dark skin, with a curiosity she couldn't interpret. She smiled at her teacher, who nodded without missing a beat as she manipulated a complicated proof on the chalkboard. Amina loved math. She found solace in the logic of numbers, the irreducible clarity of equations that respected no human bias. 15 minutes into the lesson, Amina felt a familiar tug in her bag. Her pen, a simple black ballpoint, had slipped to the bottom. She scanned the room, noticing that most of her classmates began lessons with pens placed atop their notebooks. She reached into her bag and realized that she'd forgotten to pack her pen refill. Panic fluttered. She could use a borrowed pen, but she always preferred her own, the one that didn't smudge. She turned to her left and saw Leah, a girl with honey blonde hair and clear pale skin, writing rapidly on a worksheet. Leah and she had become friends last year, tutoring together in the library. She offered a smile. "Can I borrow a pen?" Leah paused mid-sentence, looking at her with slight hesitation. Sure," she said finally, rummaging through her pencil case and pulling out a blue pen. Amina took it with a grateful nod. Just as she pressed the metal tip to the paper, she noticed movement at the front of the room. Mrs. Patel was approaching. She held a stack of worksheets and wore a stern expression that seemed to grow darker as she came closer. Amina straightened her back, expecting the usual polite good morning that Mrs. Patel offered to most students. But instead she heard, "Where did you get that pen?" Amina blinked. "Leah lent it to me," she said softly, hoping this was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Patel's brow furrowed. She took the pen from Amina and turned it over with a practiced twist. Why would you use a pen that doesn't belong to you? She demanded. Don't you have your own supplies? Amina felt a flush rise in her cheeks. I do, she responded, her voice quiet. But I forgot my refill this morning. No excuses, Mrs. Patel cut in, pointing the pen emphatically. You're not allowed to use someone else's pen. It's unsanitary and inappropriate, especially now with all the health concerns. If you cannot come prepared, you will sit out of the lesson until you replace it. Amina's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She glanced at Leah, who lowered her eyes and looked away, as though wishing she had never lent the pen in the first place. She felt an undeniable sting, as though the air around her had suddenly turned acidic. The other students watched, their faces blank or inscrutable, as Mrs. Patel continued, her voice now cold and instructional. Tomorrow, bring your own pen, or you will not be permitted to write. Is that clear? A nearly imperceptible murmur rose from the desks, a dozen hushed voices asking hush in return. Amina closed her eyes for a second, inhaled, and said, Yes, ma'am. She placed the pen on the desk, but Mrs. Patel did not give it back. With a gesture, she indicated the wastebasket. Amina understood. Throw it away. She picked up the pen, but instead of tossing it, she slipped it into her pocket. She would not let the pen be destroyed over the fact that her skin was different. She had a dozen identical pens at home, and it would cost too much money to replace them constantly. But to keep her dignity, she would not discard what didn't belong to her. She watched as Mrs. Patel returned to the blackboard, writing a series of quadratic functions in neat chalk. The lesson resumed, and Amina copied the equations into her notebook, mind swirling with shame and indignation. Each curve she sketched felt like a testament to her resilience. She would not make herself smaller for someone else's discomfort. Later that afternoon, she confided in her best friend Lila as they gathered their things in the parking lot. A persistent drizzle had begun, and they huddled under a small awning near the front gate. Lila's skin was pale, her hair a riot of copper curls. She shook her head as though warning herself against stupidity. That was so cruel, Amina, she said. Did she really tell you to throw the pen away? Amina nodded. She said it was unsanitary. She said a pen is personal property, and I had no right. Her voice caught. She felt tears stinging her eyes. I've never been treated like this in school. Lila reached out and squeezed her arm gently. You're smart, you're kind, and you deserve better. We should tell someone. That was blatant discrimination. Amina bristled at the word discrimination. It felt too charged, like a word reserved for grand courtrooms and TV news. She shook her head. I don't want to make a fuss. It was just one moment. I'll buy a new pen tomorrow and everything will be fine. But deep down, she knew that her silence would not make the weight disappear. After school, she walked home in the gray drizzle, the cobblestone sidewalks flickering wet beneath her feet. The neighborhood was quiet. Most people had retreated indoors from the chill. Passing rows of neat brick houses with small lawns, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the knowledge that she did not truly belong, that her presence might always be a source of discomfort to someone. She did not tell her parents that day. She had spent years sheltering them from her school life. Her mother, a nurse, worked double shifts, and her father worked as an auto mechanic in a shop across town. She did not want them to worry more than they already did about bills and the future. That night, sleep came fitfully. In the tangle of dreams, she returned to Mrs. Patel's classroom, pen in hand, hearing the teacher's voice echoing with judgment. She woke at dawn, feeling the ache of her emotions as though it were a physical wound. She rose, stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, smooth, dark skin, wide eyes that sometimes looked too large for her face, lips pressed in a worried line. She took a deep breath, remembering the words her mother had told her when she was a child. You are proud of who you are. You come from a lineage of queens, inventors, poets. Do not ever think otherwise. She squeezed her eyes shut, memorizing the texture of her hair as she tied it back. She would face the day, and she would be herself. In class the next morning, Amina came prepared. 3 new black pens, each identical to the one she had borrowed. When she settled into Mrs. Patel's room, she placed them neatly on top of her notebook. The teacher entered, acknowledged the class with her customary stern nod, and began the lesson. 15 minutes in, though, Mrs. Patel paused and said, Amina, step forward. A mixture of shock and panic rose in her chest. Leah, sitting nearby, bit her lip in concern. Amina slowly approached the front of the room. She dared not meet the teacher's eyes. Mrs. Patel said, I noticed you brought 3 pens today. Tell us why. Amina's throat tightened. She straightened her shoulders and answered quietly, I brought them in case one went missing or ran out of ink. I can't afford to be without a pen. She recalled the way Mrs. Patel had spoken as though she were not even a human being, but some lesser creature. The other students waited, their pens poised over their notebooks. She felt all eyes on her, burning embers of curiosity and judgment. Mrs. Patel's lips thinned. You do realize that bringing multiple pens is excessive? Why not just one like everyone else? Amina drew a breath. She had rehearsed her response, but now her voice quavered. Because sometimes people will take my pen or assume I can't be responsible, and then I'd have nothing to do my work. I just wanted to be prepared. The air felt suffocating. Students looked at their desks. Some reached to tighten their grip on their pens, as though they might vanish. Mrs. Patel stared at her with something unreadable in her eyes. Finally, after a moment that stretched too long, she said, Very well. You may keep your pens, but do not let me catch you giving one to anyone else. Understood? Amina swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. She returned to her desk, heart pounding. Throughout the class, she wrote her equations, but the rhythm of her pen felt off, as though she were solving problems while the teacher's gaze weighed upon her back. When the bell rang, she packed up silently and left. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pools of golden light on the pavement. She inhaled that light as though it were air itself, letting it fill her lungs. She pressed her backpack to her chest, promising herself that she would not allow this to define her. That evening, Amina told her parents what had happened. They listened with grave expressions as she described the incident, the pen, and the teacher's cold instructions. Her mother held her close and whispered, You do the right thing, no matter what. Holding onto these pens is your right, because you worked hard for them. Her father, a gentle man with hands roughened by years of working on engines, said, You should not be treated that way. We will go speak to the school tomorrow. Amina shook her head. She did not want her parents to sacrifice their jobs, risk taking time off, or be seen as overbearing immigrants who objected to anything. She gently waved her hand. I'm okay. I can handle it. In the days that followed, the pen incident drifted through the school's grapevine. Conversations backstage in the auditorium, whispers in the math lab, half-heard comments in the cafeteria. Did you hear what Mrs. Patel said to Amina? Appendix 1 was something about unsanitary conditions. I thought that was, weird. I saw Amina give the pen back, so I don't know why there was such a fuss. Some students defended her quietly. Others accepted the teacher's actions without question. It was, as many students would later say, just another odd moment in the adult world that high school kids didn't fully understand. But one student, a boy named Ryan Woods, was different. Ryan sat 2 rows ahead of Amina in history class. He was tall and gangly, with a mop of curly brown hair that always seemed disheveled. He was known for being outspoken, sometimes to a fault. That day, he approached her during the little break between classes and said, Look, I saw what happened. That was messed up. Amina offered a small, tired smile. She pressed a hand to her book bag strap. It's okay, Ryan. I'm not going to make a big deal. He shook his head, frowning. It's a big deal. You shouldn't have to keep your pens like that. I'm going to call out Mrs. Patel in class if I have to. She lifted a hand. I don't want you to get in trouble either. He shrugged. It's not about me. I just know it's wrong. He offered her a thumbs up and turned away. Amina stood for a moment, watching his retreating figure, and felt a flicker of gratitude for someone willing to speak up on her behalf. That afternoon, she walked to the school library to study for her upcoming test on quadratic functions. The librarian, Mrs. Grant, welcomed her with a nod as she passed by rows of textbooks. The library was a sanctuary, quiet, hushed, the spines of books beckoning like silent allies. She borrowed a calculus reference book and settled into a corner table near a tall window that looked out on oak trees. She turned the pages and lost herself in integrals and limits, the logic of mathematics comforting her. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice the slender girl in a UN t-shirt approach her until she tapped her on the shoulder. Amina looked up to see a student journalist named Cara Miller. Cara was known for the school newspaper, which she had launched as a freshman. She had an earnest face and a tight ponytail, and she held a small digital recorder in one hand. Hi, Amina, right? Cara asked. Amina nodded, slightly confused. Yes, hi. Cara flipped the recorder on. I'm writing a story for the Northbrook High Times. I heard about what happened in math class. Mrs. Patel telling you to throw away the pen because of sanitary concerns. That's something. Would you be willing to share your experience? Amina hesitated. She had not wanted attention. She closed her math book and set it aside. I don't know, she said. I don't want it to get out of hand. Kara's eyes softened. I get it. But it's important. Others should know. If it's unchecked, it could escalate. She offered a sympathetic smile. I can keep your name anonymous if you prefer. Amina thought of her parents, their steady support, and their worries. She thought of every time she had swallowed her voice rather than speak up, every time she had endured a small slight rather than cause a scene. She took a breath. Okay, she said. I'll talk on the record. But I don't want my picture in the paper. Kara nodded, lowering the recorder. Fair enough. Start wherever you want. So, Amina told her story. How she had borrowed that pen. How Mrs. Patel had refused to return it. How she had been forced to keep her own pens under suspicion. She spoke quietly but deliberately, describing the ways in which it made her feel unseen and unwelcome. When she finished, Kara offered her a bottle of water and said, Thank you, Amina. This matters. The next morning, the school found a small article on the front page of the Northbrook High Times titled, Student Says Teacher's Pen Policy May Mask Bias. Inside, Kara recounted Amina's account without naming her, describing Mrs. Patel's insistence that students not share pens for sanitary reasons, and noting that other students said they had never heard of similar restrictions applied unevenly. It included brief commentary from a school board representative who said they would look into cursory policies around shared supplies. Mrs. Patel was quoted only as saying, The policy is for all students. We want to ensure germ transmission is minimized. Some students scoffed and said it was nothing, but others talked about pen sharing more warily. Teachers gave half-hearted glances as they passed in the halls. Amina felt both vindicated and nervous. Would the teacher retaliate? Would her peers now mock her even more? That same afternoon, Amina returned home to find her younger brother, Sammy, sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling in a notebook. Their mother had called and said she'd come home early to cook dinner. Sammy looked up with bright, curious eyes. Hey, big sis, did you see the paper today? He thrust a folded copy of the school newspaper toward her. On the back page was Kara's article. Amina read it quickly, her cheeks flushing. She saw herself, described in third person, anonymous but unmistakably her. She nodded at Sammy. Yeah, it's out there now. He frowned. Are you okay? She ruffled his short hair. I am, thanks. She heard her mother's car pull into the driveway and rose to set the kettle on the stove, trying to push away the swirl of anxiety. Dinner was a family affair. Her brother insisted on telling jokes about physics. Her parents listened with rapt attention, as though the world outside could never touch their small circle. Yet, Amina could not erase the gnawing feeling at her core. What if this turned into more than just a newspaper article? What if her college applications were somehow affected? What if Mrs. Patel turned against her? She set aside her food, telling herself to eat later. After dinner, she went to her room and opened a simple email draft, addressing it to several local news outlets. She wrote a brief description of the pen incident, offering her story in case they wanted more. She hesitated, clicked send, and felt the weight of that simple act, broadcasting her private hurt to the whole community. She immediately regretted it. Had she just made everything worse? She closed her eyes and lay down on her bed, staring at the ceiling, willing her heart to slow. That night, she tossed and turned, haunted by the possibility that she had invited too much attention. She thought of the instances when people had told her to keep her head down, to be grateful for every chance she got, to not stir the pot. She wondered if she had now stirred a pot she could not control. Finally, close to dawn, she drifted into restless sleep. The next morning, she awoke to the insistent ringing of her phone. She squinted at the screen. Kara Miller, she answered groggily. Hello? Kara's voice cracked with excitement. Amina, I have some news. 2 local news stations want to do segments. They saw your email. They think your story is important. Amina sat up, adrenaline surging. But that's... Her voice trailed off. She felt both frightened and strangely electrified. Kara continued, Also, I spoke to a friend whose father works at a city-level nonprofit. He said that if it gets more attention, the UN's youth ambassadors might reach out. They do a campaign on inclusive education. He thinks your story could be featured. Amina closed her eyes, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she whispered. Kara replied gently, You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. but you have the chance to speak for kids who might be afraid to speak for themselves. Think about it. Amina ended the call and lay back, the ceiling boards above her almost glowing with possibility, like lanterns guiding her. By mid-morning, local reporters were filing onto the front lawn of Northbrook High. A news van idled near the curb, lights flashing orange. Students gathered in small huddles, their phones out. Amina walked to school with her backpack heavier than ever before. She ducked around the side entrance, hoping to avoid attention, but the moment she stepped onto campus, she realized it was too late. Cameras were pointed in every direction. A microphone extended toward her, a reporter's voice cooing, "Amina, can you tell us how you felt when Mrs. Patel refused you a pen?" She felt as though she were a balloon about to burst. She took a breath. "It made me feel like I had no rights in my own classroom," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Not like my presence was an inconvenience." The camera flashed, the microphone pulled back, and she walked away, head held high, though her legs felt unsteady. Inside, the day passed in a blur. In the halls, a few students nodded at her respectfully, while others stared as though she were on display. In Mrs. Patel's room, for once, the teacher did not say a word to her. She taught the lesson about quadratic equations, without even a glance in Amina's direction. It felt like punishment by silence. When the bell rang, Amina gathered her things and slipped out of the room. She found Kara waiting by the library. Kara handed her a small stack of printed articles, 2 from local TV sites, 1 from the city newspaper. Amina read them quickly, her heart thumping. Each headline screamed, "Local teen sheds light on classroom bias," "Pen refusal leads to citywide outrage," "UNI's Northbrook case as example of everyday racism." She closed her eyes, felt a tear slip down her cheek. Kara put a hand on her shoulder. "You're changing things," she said softly. That night after dinner, her parents hugged her tightly as she described the day. Her father's eyes were bright. "I'm proud of you," he said. Her mother's voice trembled slightly. "I worry, but I'm proud." Amina forced a smile. She did not yet know how to reconcile pride with fear. Over the next 48 hours, the story spread like wildfire. The local TV station interviewed her at their studio beneath bright lights. She sat on a stool, flanked by 2 news anchors, asking her about policies, equity, and what the school should do. She answered carefully, leaning on truth and kindness. The segment aired that evening during the 6 o'clock news, with a short editorial by the lead anchor about how everyday prejudices could turn into systemic barriers. On social media, students and alumni wrote in. Some condemned her bravery, others accused her of seeking attention, but most messages, by far, were supportive. "Thank you for speaking up. I experienced something similar. Proud to be in your class." She read these messages late into the night, tears of both sadness and relief reddening her eyes. Then, on the 3rd day, her phone rang before dawn. A number with a New York City area code flashed. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello?" A dignified voice said, "This is Elizabeth Armstrong, speaking from the office of the UN Youth Ambassadors Program. We have been following your story, and we would like to invite you to participate in a virtual roundtable discussion next week on inclusive education. Would you be interested?" Amina closed her eyes, astonished. Her voice caught. "Yes," she managed. "I would be honored." The voice on the other end chuckled gently. "Wonderful. We'll send you the details. Congratulations." The rest of that day was a whirlwind. She had to prepare by writing talking points, reviewing statistics about educational inequality, and rehearsing how to speak on camera. She lived in a haze of Zoom rehearsals and email exchanges with UN staff who sent her briefing documents. On the morning of the roundtable, she wore a simple white blouse and pressed her hair neatly back, her heart pounding so hard she thought the microphone would pick up her pulse. She connected via video link and found herself in a grid of boxes, each one occupied by a young person from a different corner of the globe. There was Luis from Brazil, whose accent was lilting, Fatima from Jordan, whose eyes shone with intelligence, and Tashi from Nepal, whose background in local activism spoke volumes from the way she sat upright. Each of them had a story, of discrimination, of triumph, of courage. When it was Amina's turn, she took a breath and spoke of that pen, that tiny tool that had become proof that discrimination still permeated everyday life. She talked of how it felt unseen, of how a teacher's single act could ripple into questions of self-worth. She ended by saying, "If our classrooms are not places of respect, they are not places of learning. Every student must feel they belong, not just in theory, but in every action." from the books they read to the pens they use. Her words settled across the screen like a hush. Then Luis spoke about the lack of textbooks in his rural school. Fatima discussed the barriers girls faced in her country. Tashi described how, in his town, children who spoke minority languages were mocked by teachers. The moderator, a sharply dressed UN official, leaned forward and said, "Thank you, Amina. Your story resonates deeply." She invited them to propose changes: policies for free supplies, anti-bias training for teachers, robust reporting mechanisms for students. Amina watched, feeling a power she had never known. Her voice, once small and hesitant in a cramped classroom, had become a beacon for others. By the end of the roundtable, the UN Youth Ambassadors Program issued a statement highlighting Amina's case as a catalyst for a global campaign called Pens for All, aiming to ensure that no child felt denied by something as basic as a writing tool. She was named a youth ambassador herself, invited to participate in a series of webinars, and her story was included in the UN's monthly newsletter sent to thousands of members worldwide. Her inbox overflowed with emails from supportive strangers, teachers, activists, authors, offering words of encouragement and pledging to join the campaign. News of her involvement reached her hometown, and the school board called an emergency meeting. Parents, teachers, and students crowded into the auditorium, debating policies on shared supplies, bias training, and inclusive practices. Mrs. Patel was in attendance, her expression unreadable as she sat among her peers. At one point, a former student stood to speak, saying, "We cannot unsee what we have seen. We cannot ignore what our students have to endure. A pen is not just a pen if it defines who is worthy." Amina sat in the audience and felt a lump rise in her throat. She resisted the urge to stand up and shout, "That is exactly what I said." But the room erupted in applause anyway, as though her words echoed from somewhere unseen. In the days that followed, Mrs. Patel met with the principal and the school board. She issued a statement in which she apologized for her handling of the pen incident, acknowledging that her actions had been rooted in fear rather than rule. She spoke of her regret, of her commitment to learn about implicit bias, and of her desire to improve her classroom practices. Amina, when she heard this, felt a complicated twist of relief, sorrow, and cautious optimism. She accepted the apology, but she would never forget the sting of humiliation. On the Friday evening of the following week, Amina sat on her bed gazing at her computer screen. An email from the UN had arrived with an invitation she could hardly believe. "Dear Amina Hassan, we would like to invite you to speak at the UN headquarters in New York City this summer at the Global Youth Forum on Education. Your insight and courage have inspired thousands. We look forward to your presence." She stared at those words. Global Youth Forum, UN headquarters, New York City. It felt as though she had fallen through a wormhole from a single act of discrimination into an entirely new universe of possibilities. She ran to her parents' bedroom, breathless with the news. She flung her arms around them, and they erupted in tears of joy. Her father's hands trembled against her back as he said, "My daughter, a UN speaker." Her mother pressed her forehead to Amina's cheek and whispered, "See, you are exactly where you belong." That night, Amina lay in bed, her heart full and her mind racing with the journey ahead. She thought back to that day in math class, to the sting of being told to throw away a pen, to the shame that had cut through her like a blade. She thought of all the moments since then, speaking to cameras, addressing international audiences, rallying student peers, and leading a campaign she had never imagined. And she realized that sometimes the smallest injustices could be the spark for the greatest changes. Over the next months, preparations consumed her: logistics for travel, drafts of speeches, interviews with journalists. She wrote her keynote address by hand, scribbling lines about equality, dignity, and the transformative power of empathy. Every word felt sacred. We carry within us the right to learn, the right to write, and the right to be respected. No child should ever feel that she is not worthy of a pen, a book, or a voice. She polished it until late nights, discovering that the careful selection of each phrase mattered. She practiced in front of the mirror, adjusting her posture and expression so her message would land with clarity and conviction. When the day finally arrived for her departure, the airport terminal was a swirl of farewells and security lines. Her parents and younger brother stood near the gate, waving as she walked toward the TSA checkpoint. Her mother pressed a small, polished wooden box into her hand. "This is from your grandfather," she said softly. Amina opened it and found a simple wooden pen, engraved with her name, A. Hassan. Her grandfather had given it to her for her 14th birthday, telling her to write her dreams. Now it felt heavier with meaning. She closed the box and slipped it into her purse, breathing in a promise of hope. On the plane, she gazed out at the clouds, a river of white that held no boundaries. She thought of those clouds as vessels carrying her story to a global audience. When her flight touched down at JFK, she felt the sharp tang of New York air, laced with possibility and promise. A UN representative met her at the terminal and whisked her away in a black SUV through the streets of Manhattan. Skyscrapers looming overhead, yellow cabs darting through traffic, the city pulsing with life. She felt both small and significant, a single thread in a tapestry that stretched across the entire world. That evening, she toured the UN headquarters, the General Assembly Hall with its long wooden benches and towering ceiling, the Security Council chamber with its solemn hush, the halls lined with flags from almost every nation on earth. She stood before the portrait of Dag Hammarskjöld and felt a reverence she had never known. She was here not as a visitor, but as a speaker, a youth ambassador whose journey had begun with a single borrowed pen and a single moment of discrimination. She thought, if I can transform shame into purpose, anyone can. On the morning of the Global Youth Forum, she walked onto the dais to applause from hundreds of young delegates from every corner of the globe. Sierra Leone, Brazil, Japan, Canada, India, Ghana. She wore a modest navy dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and held the wooden pen her grandfather had given her. Microphones hovered before her as she surveyed the audience. Faces bright with hope, weariness, determination. She saw in them reflections of her own journey. Each had their pen stolen or their voice silenced or their humanity questioned. They sat together, a mosaic of skin tones and languages, bound by a shared commitment to education and equity. When she stepped to the podium, the room settled into a hush. She placed the wooden pen on the lectern, its grain catching the light. She leaned forward and began, "When I was 16, a teacher refused to let me use a pen because of my skin color. That one act of bias taught me that even in places built for learning, we can feel invisible. But I also learned that when we speak up, when we refuse to accept the small injustices, we can ignite change that ripples across oceans. Today I stand before you not just as a student, but as a reminder that every young person, regardless of the color of their skin or the shape of their dreams, deserves the dignity to write their own story." She paused as the clapping rose, feeling the surge of solidarity. She went on to speak of Pens for All, the campaign that now reached thousands, of the scholarships and writing workshops they plan to open in marginalized communities worldwide, of the next generation of teachers they would train to recognize and overcome their own biases. She spoke of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit that refused to accept invisibility. When she finished, the hall erupted. Delegates rose to their feet. A chant arose in multiple languages. "Pens for all! Pens for all!" She held back tears, her heart pounding. She picked up the wooden pen and raised it high, as though bridging worlds. That moment would be broadcast live to millions. Images of a dark-skinned girl from Northbrook High holding the instrument of her grandfather's gift, demanding respect and dignity for every child. In the weeks and months that followed, Amina's life transformed again. She collaborated with UN officials to draft policy recommendations on educational equity, traveled to speak at youth conferences in Nairobi and Paris, and advised NGOs on how to implement anti-bias curricula. She returned to Northbrook High as a hero. Banners hung in the cafeteria, teachers greeted her with newfound warmth, and even Mrs. Patel caught her in the hallway, offering a nod of respect. The two had a brief conversation. Mrs. Patel quietly asked if Amina would consider mentoring teachers on bias. Amina agreed, her voice now firm, her determination unwavering. On graduation day, the school invited her to deliver the commencement speech. She stood at the podium beneath a banner that read, "Together we rise." She wore a deep burgundy gown, the UN lapel pin glinting on the fabric. As she looked out at the sea of young faces, some bright-eyed, others worried, she felt the weight of every moment that had led her here. The teacher's harsh words, the borrowed pen, the indignation that turned into action, the global platform she had unintentionally built. She began, "We live in a world where small acts of exclusion can feel like towering walls. But I want you to remember that every step toward justice begins with a single act of courage. For me, it was holding onto a pen that wasn't mine. But for you, it might be asking a question no one else dares to ask, or lending a hand when everyone else turns away. Our greatest power lies not in grand speeches or impressive accolades, but in the everyday choices to affirm each other's humanity." The crowd sat in reverent silence, and she watched tears glisten in the eyes of classmates who once whispered about her in the hallway. She closed her eyes briefly, savoring the moment, and then she continued, her voice steady. When we refuse to see each other as problems to be solved, and instead recognize each other as partners in shaping our future, we transform our schools, our communities, and yes, our world. Never underestimate the power of a single voice, a single pen, a single act of resistance, because that small spark can ignite the brightest flame of change. When she concluded, thunderous applause swept across the field. She raised her hands in both victory and gratitude, the embodiment of a generation refusing to be silenced. In that instant, she realized that belonging was not something granted. It was something claimed and defended, one pen stroke at a time. Years later, when she became a renowned human rights attorney, she would look back on that moment, standing before the UN, holding her grandfather's pen, and remember the day a simple request for a writing tool became the catalyst for a movement. She would tell her own children about it, reminding them that justice often begins in the smallest of details: a pen, a word, a gesture of kindness. She would ensure they understood that dignity was not negotiable and that every voice mattered. And in her heart, she would carry the knowledge that one person, armed with nothing more than courage and conviction, could stand up to discrimination, transform her community, and one day even address the world. And that sometimes it really does. Start with refusing to throw away a pen.